morning. Thank you, Maynard, for leading us in worship this morning. Want to welcome all of our guests. We're glad that you're here. We hope that you're able to stick around a little bit after service and let us get to know you a little bit. We also want to welcome those who are online. We're grateful that you're joining us. And I want to extend a happy Father's Day to all the fathers among us. It is a wonderful day. I'm sure there will be a great number of you who will be firing up the grill and cooking outside and trying to be the grill master. I don't want to brag, but I have put in some time and effort to try to master the grill, if you were. And I don't know that I've mastered the grill so much as tried cooking lots of things on the grill, whether it be some vegetables here and there or different kinds of meats or even bacon. I can't say that the bacon went the best. It was a little bit dangerous. The second time I did it, it was a little bit better, but not maybe my brightest moment. In fact, when it comes to cooking in general, the grill is probably my best domain as I move towards baking and less towards cooking, whether that be inside or out. My skills kind of go downhill. My wife tells me it's because I don't know how to follow a recipe. I don't know what she's talking about. I think experimentation is excellent. Anyway, this last week, or maybe it was a week before last, Alyssa was going through her Instagram feed, and she came across a really funny post, and I'm like, you have to send that to me so I can share it on Father's Day, because it's absolutely perfect. So let me see if I can do this without completely butchering this. So a husband texts his wife, how do you roast, let's see here, get the going. All right, how do you roast a cobbler? And the wife responds kind of frantically, what? Well, first of all, you need to use the recipes and look in my binder of desserts over by the toaster oven. Then she texts, preheat the oven. My wife is always on top of that. She's always on me because I'm not waiting for the oven to preheat. She says, use the peaches and not the apples because the peaches are starting to go bad. And then she says, check the cabinet by the fridge. Most of the spices you'll need are in there. And keep an eye on the timer. Please don't let it burn. And then he responds, you make fun of his shoes. I thought it was funny. It's a great dad joke. It's definitely a conversation that me and my wife would have. Anyway, I thought it was funny. This Father's Day, we're going to be looking at Abraham, the father of the faithful, the father of a multitude, the father of many of our religions today in our world, right? Whether it be Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, they all look up to Abraham as the patriarch of the faith. Abraham is a man who is worthy of honor and worthy of the respect that he is given. He's a great man of faith and has given a great legacy that we look up to. But it is important to acknowledge that Abraham is indeed a flawed man. Abraham is a flawed man. When God calls him at the age of 75, Abraham leaves his family, out of the things that he knows, and he heads out into the unknown to head towards the promised land of Canaan, where he is promised to become a father of a multitude. But Sarah is barren, and they will remain barren, in fact, for 11 more years after this. It's clear from the text that Abraham desires children. He wants to be a father. And we see his fathering spirit in the way that he interacts with those under his care. We see it in the way that he interacts with Lot, who is his nephew, and he even risks his life to bring him back safely after Sodom and Gomorrah are attacked and he's carried off into captivity. Abraham goes with great gusto and takes his men and rescues his nephew Lot. He allows him to take the pick of the land as their possessions become numerous to supply the land being together. Abraham really takes Lot under his wing and takes care of this young man. And yet, despite the fact that we see Abraham taking care of Lot, as we see him take care of those who are under his care as far as his workers, Abraham remains fatherless. For 11 years, he remains fatherless until around Genesis 15. And in Genesis chapter 15, God comes to Abraham again, and we start up our reading in verse 2. But Abraham says to God, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus." And Abraham said, "Behold, you have given me no offspring, and the members of my household will be my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, "This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir." And he brought him outside and said, "Look towards the heavens and number the stars if you are able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And he, Abraham, believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. We're not sure exactly how old Abraham is here, probably around 85-ish, somewhere around in there. Abraham has been faithfully living and following God for around 10-ish years. And for all of his care over Lot, for all his care under those who are working for him, Abraham continues to be childless. Despite following God faithfully, he continues to be childless. And God comes to him and renews his covenant with him. And Abraham, with a lot of gusto, says, "Well, why are you going to continue to bless me with even more? I have more than I need, and everything that I have is going to go to one of my workers. Why would you bless me? Because you haven't given me children. You promised that I would become a great multitude, and yet I remain childless." And God says, "Don't worry, I am going to give you children. I am going to be faithful to what I have promised." And Abraham takes the word of God and says it's as good as done. If God says he's going to give me children, then God's going to give me children. And Abraham believes God. And because of that, it's credited to him as righteousness. And it's not long after this. We don't know exactly how long, a year, maybe two, maybe a little bit longer. We have Ishmael being born. Ishmael is born soon after this. And it would appear from the text that Abraham believes that God has now been faithful to his promise. God has fulfilled his promise in Ishmael, and Abraham loves Ishmael. He takes care of Ishmael. And we see this love of Ishmael in what happens in Genesis chapter 17. Starting in verse 17, we really get a feel for this. "Then Abraham fell on his face in laughter, and he said to himself, 'Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?' And Abraham said to God, 'Oh, that Ishmael might live before you.' But God said, 'No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. And he shall be a father of 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, and whom Sarah shall bear to you this time next year.'" Abraham loved Ishmael. He was his beloved son. And for years he had raised him and taken care of him as his own son, because he was his own son. And he looked after him and he cared for him, and he thought the promise of God was fulfilled. And then we have God coming to him again and saying, "I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you fruitful. I'm going to fulfill my promise of the coming seed promise to you. And Sarah's going to bear a son." And Abraham begins to laugh. He says, "Why would you bless me with another son? I have one. May he be the one who is the son of promise. May he be the one through whom you work." And Abraham really goes to bat for Ishmael. He besieges God and advocates before God for his son. And God listens to him and says, "I will take care of Ishmael. He will become great. He will become prosperous. But my plan, my covenant is going to be through Isaac. He's going to be the son of promise. He's going to be the one through whom the covenant is being made." And as we see the issues unfold as Isaac comes on the scene, and the relationship between Hagar and Sarah and Ishmael and Isaac, the family becomes messy. And honestly, as we look at family throughout the whole of the Bible, one of the things that we see is that family is not portrayed as neat and tidy and everything is always hunky-dory. It's shown in all of its complicatedness and all of its messiness. The Bible doesn't overshadow this. It doesn't gloss over this fact that family interactions are messy. They're not clean. They're not always tidy. There's conflict and there's drama. But we see that as God continues to fulfill His promise and His covenant relationship with Isaac, God also takes care of Ishmael. He takes care of Ishmael, He takes care of Hagar, and Abraham is able to take care of both of them to some extent, and he's also able to pass on his faith. In Genesis chapter 21, I think we see Abraham being a great father, and I think often we miss this point. We miss this in the story, but it's an important thing to take note of. In Genesis chapter 21, we read, starting in verse 32, "So they made a covenant at Beersheba, and Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and called there upon the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines." We looked at this passage a few years back when we were studying the names of God. And I think this is one of those passages that in studying Abraham as a father, we would quickly pass over. But because of that study of the everlasting God, we see a great example of Abraham being a great father. See, as Abraham makes a treaty with Abimelech, his faith is not in the treaty. His faith is not in the relationship now formed between him and Abimelech. His focus is not so much even the now peace between him and Abimelech. See, Abraham's focus and his trust is in God, and his focus and his forward looking is towards the future. See, a tamarisk tree takes a long time to grow. It starts out as a small bush. It's going to take many, many years until this bush becomes a tree, and the shade that the tamarisk tree provides is amazingly cool. It's amazingly beneficial. When you plant a tamarisk tree, you don't plant it for yourself. You plant it for the next generation. See, when Abraham made this covenant, this treaty with Abimelech, he is looking towards the future, not for himself, but for his offspring. And his faith isn't in Abimelech's willingness and ability to keep the treaty. His faith is in God. And after he makes this treaty, he's looking towards the future. He's looking for the benefit to his offspring, and he plants a tamarisk tree. And I think this really is an important lesson for us as fathers to be looking towards the future and considering what legacy we're going to be leaving to our children. Making sure that we're taking care of not just ourselves, but we're looking towards the future to take care of our offspring after us, that we're looking towards the next generation and what we're going to leave them. It's important that we leave not just a financial inheritance or leave our children maybe on a better financial footing than we ourselves were on, but it's important that we leave them a foundation and a legacy for life, that we live out our faith in such a way that they have a better foundation to raise their children upon, so that they're able to then bless the next generation. Now, this takes a lot of intentionality on our part, doesn't it? This means that we have to be honest about who we want to be and actually live up to that. That we have to be honest with our kids as we fail. As we fail to live up to the men that we want to be, so that we can demonstrate to our sons and to our daughters the kind of men they should expect in their life and who our sons should seek to be, living them out an example, and for our daughters, the kind of men they should seek to marry. When we look at the life of Abraham, one of the things that we see is that Abraham passes on his faith, but he also passes on some of his failures. Right? Abraham passes on his failure in the fact that he calls his wife, Sarah, his sister, twice. And when we look at Isaac, he also commits the same failure. He calls his wife Rebekah his sister, cousin technically. But he also commits this sin, right? Because Abraham failed to deal with his stuff, he passed it along to his son. And I think this is a lesson for us as well. We have to deal with our stuff. We have to deal with the traumas that we've been handed down from our forefathers. We have to deal with the traumas we ourselves have dealt with so that we can pass on to the next generation a better legacy than even we were left. This takes intentionality. This takes humility. This means that we have to seek to be better men, to be better fathers. Now, we see that Abraham was seeking to leave a good legacy to his children. We see that he became the father of a multitude, that he was the father of the faithful. And generations after, and even to today, we look back at Abraham and the legacy that he left, and we see that he has left a good legacy despite his failures. One of the ways that I think we see this legacy demonstrated is in Genesis chapter 22 and the sacrificing of Isaac, or the asking to sacrifice Isaac. And when we look at this story, I think we kind of look in horror, because we see Isaac as this young boy who's being led by his father up the mountain, and this father who maybe in blind zeal for serving God is willing to kill his own son. But I think the whole story really gets turned on its head, and the message of the story to some extent gets turned on its head when we realize how old Isaac was. So the question has to be raised, well, how old is Isaac? Well, first and foremost, the Scriptures don't tell us. We don't know how old Isaac is. It does give us a range. It was sometime after he was weaned, around the age of 5, and it was sometime before the death of Sarah, around the age of 37. So that's a pretty large age range. But the Scriptures do give us a few clues to give us an indication of the age of Isaac. He was past the age of being weaned, and it was before Sarah's death, but it was also, Isaac had to have been strong enough to carry the wood up the mountain, up Mount Moriah. He had to be strong enough to carry the wood. And we're not talking about a small bundle of sticks here. We're talking about a large portion of sticks, right? So we're talking about somebody who had to have been strong enough to carry a large burden of lumber uphill for his father. So we're looking at somebody who's in his late teens, at least, if not early 20s. Most scholars put Isaac around the age of 20. Jewish tradition actually puts him at age 37. I don't know if that has to do with the fact that when Abraham and Isaac got back home and they told Sarah what happened, she had a heart attack and died. I'm sure most mama bears would not have been happy to have heard what happened there. But there's some sort of a older child, right, a young man that we're dealing with here, and we don't know the exact age, right? Now, giving the parallelism between Genesis 22 and the prophetic aspect of Genesis 22 and Jesus, we could easily put his age at 33. I'm not saying that is the age, but it would very much fit with the parallelism of this passage. But the point really is not how old Isaac is. The real point comes down to the fact that Isaac was very clearly, throughout the Scriptures, strong enough to have not been overpowered by his 100-plus-year-old father, right? Isaac had to have gotten on the altar willingly. That's the big point. He had to have gotten upon that altar willingly. At some point, Abraham had to explain to Isaac that the lamb that was promised by God, that God would provide, was himself. That the purpose of them coming, what God had asked, was that Abraham sacrifice his beloved son of promise. And the life that Abraham had lived before his son, and the legacy that he had passed on to his son Isaac at that point in his life, was enough for Isaac to step out in faith alongside of his father and to say, I will willingly follow God alongside you. And he was willingly bound and placed upon the altar and came a hair's breadth close to death before God stopped him and provided a ram instead. In seeing Abraham's obedience here, we also see, and faith, we also see Isaac's obedience and faith. We see a legacy that Abraham had passed on to his son that shows the life that was lived before him, leaving him a legacy of faith, leaving him an authentic faith. Abraham had lived out his faith in such a way before Isaac that he also had faith in God, that he was willing to trust God with his very life. So as we look at this, the life of Abraham, the father of the faithful, we see a legacy of faith that is passed on to the next generation. We see a legacy of faith that we are called to pass on to our sons and daughters as well. And we have to consider, what legacy are we leaving behind? Are we living out who we want to be? When we look in the mirror, Do we see the man that we want to be? Do we see the person that we're called to be? Or do we see somebody who's failing to live up to that? And if we're failing to live up to that, how are we seeking to make things right? Are we being honest with our children that I'm not where I want to be, that I'm not being the man that I want to be, and I fail? Are we being honest about that and seeking to deal with our issues? Are we seeking to grow in our faith and truly live out our faith, or are we going to pay lip service to come in on Sunday occasionally? Are we truly living out our faith? It's important the legacy that we leave our children. It's important the legacy that we leave our children. And Abraham, in his 70s plus, in his hundreds plus, was still seeking to live out that legacy, pass along that legacy. It's never too late. Whether you have children at home that you're seeking to pass on that legacy to, or whether you have children who are grown, we are called to leave that legacy. We are called to seek to live out our faith, seek to be honest with our children, to seek to give them a foundation upon which to build the rest of their lives, so that they don't have to relive and pass their generation to the next generation the failures of ourselves, the things that we wish we didn't have, the traumas that we've experienced. We don't want to pass along to the next generation that same concept of Abraham saying, oh, she's my sister. And the same thing we see with Isaac saying, oh, she's my sister. No, we want to pass along a better legacy than that. We want to leave that legacy of faith, that authentic faith, to the next generation. So this morning, what I want to encourage the men to do is to consider the legacy that you're leaving. And honestly, we can all consider that. What legacy are we all leaving to the next generation? Are we authentically living out our faith? Are we seeking to be those people who are living an example before the next generation? And if not, how are you going to change that? How are you going to make that right? For us as Christians, it's a reminder of why we seek to live out our faith in an authentic way. And it's a call to begin anew today to do that even better, to seek to be more and more like Christ. But it's also an opportunity for us, if we're not Christians, to begin anew, to truly seek to live out that faith. And it begins by walking that walk of faith. Maybe that means that you need to study and you're curious about what it really means to know God and to follow God, and you need to study this book so that you truly understand what God is calling you to. But maybe this morning you have studied this book. You do know what it means to be a Christian, and you're ready to die to yourself and to be washed clean in the waters of baptism. Maybe that's what you need this morning. Maybe you simply need the prayers of the congregation because you know that you're not living up to that legacy of faith, and you need to do better, and you need to make things right with your kids, and you need prayers, and you need encouragement, and you need somebody to walk alongside you. However we can assist you this morning in your walk of faith, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.